Okay, yeah, Queen Elizabeth is so major that we're going to need to spend a bit of time on this period. It's the age of Shakespeare, basically, who is, of course, the greatest writer of the period. It's as I put on the subtitle, it's the golden age, really, of Tudor England. And, okay, Elizabeth herself is a sort of iconic figure who was queen for, just like we've had Queen Victoria and we've got Queen Elizabeth II now, queen for such a long time that most people didn't know anything, never knew anything else. Right? Just like me, I've never known anything except Queen Elizabeth. She's been queen for as long as I've been alive. But that's Queen Elizabeth II, but Queen Elizabeth I was the same sort of figure. One thing about these people is that they really had quite extraordinary lives. And Elizabeth's life, right through from childhood, is, well, first of all, she's only 3 years old when her mother has her head chopped off. I mean, it's not the sort of experience that any of us would ever imagine. And like her half-sister Mary, like her elder half-sister before her, Mary, the one who was burning the Protestants, she was declared illegitimate by Henry. He wanted to say that she wasn't really his daughter. She was his daughter by Henry's second wife. After he divorced Catherine, he married Anne Boleyn, and she gave him a daughter instead of a son, and he had her head chopped off, accusing her of sleeping with other men. Well, she wasn't completely abandoned at this stage. Her attendances, her governesses, these people, they looked after her, and she got an exceptionally good education, in fact. From Champanan herself, she learned several languages, and then she came under the tutelage of William Grindal and then Roger Ascham. Roger Ascham being perhaps the most famous educationalist of his age. You can see that she learned several languages when she was very young: French, Flemish, Italian, Spanish, and she went on to be a very, very accomplished linguist, able to speak perhaps about a dozen languages. And by the time she was 18, she was known as one of the most intelligent and well-educated women in Europe. So she was kind of famous even as a child. There was a French work called The Glass, or The Mirror, or The Glass of the Sinful Soul. And Elizabeth, at the age of 11, she translated this and made it into what's called a commonplace book. You know, she made it up into a book herself, presented it in this embroidered cover to Catherine Parr, who was by this time Henry's wife. And so the young Elizabeth's kind of secondary mother, fulfilling the mother role. Catherine Parr was fair to Elizabeth and looked after her. And she gave her this book. She probably, the 11-year-old child, probably did this embroidery herself as well. We're not sure about that, but probably. And sorry, I thought I'd put a picture of the inside of the book there, but I haven't. But it's beautifully written, beautifully handwritten by an 11-year-old child. Well, at the same time as getting this wonderful education and proving to be a very, very capable, very intelligent person, she obviously suffered a lot of trauma. I mean, having your mother's head chopped off is a bad beginning, isn't it? And it's not only that, she would never be able to remember a time when she had not known that her mother had died because her father ordered it. I mean, I talk about Oedipus, okay? I mean, that's a kind of massive psychological thing to have to deal with. And it probably had its effect on the rest of her life. She wouldn't remember it itself. I mean, she'd be too young probably to remember much about it. But then it all came back when she was 8 years old, and Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, also had her head chopped off in a very similar sort of setup. So, you know, it happened once, it happens again. She's old enough at the age of 8 to have a very clear idea of what's going on. It may well have something to do with the reason why she never married. I mean, would you, if your father had chopped off two of the heads of his wives? Yeah, it was Catherine Parr was the last wife of Henry VIII, and she lived after Henry's death. She was, as I say, kind to Elizabeth and treated her, yeah, something like a mother should. But it seems that when Henry VIII, her father, died, and she went to live with his widow, she married another man. She married somebody called Thomas Seymour, and it appears that he abused her sexually. So, in addition to having her the trauma of a father who chops people's heads off, and including her own mother's head, she was sexually abused by the trusted husband of her surrogate mother. Yeah. And there are all kinds of reasons why she didn't marry. I mean, we could look at the political situation and say that actually it was a politically very shrewd move. It was politically clever of her not to marry. But whether that was really the reason or whether it was more to do with these incidents in her childhood, we'll never really know. So, yeah, it must have been a very traumatic experience to live through growing up as the young Elizabeth, future queen. At the time, we can point to a little positive aspect of her childhood. She got on pretty well with her sister, her big sister, and she also had a good relationship with her half brother, Prince Edward. So that remember, they were three of them. Okay, the two girls and the boy, all with different mothers, but all with Henry VIII as their father. And it seems she got on pretty well as a child with all of them. Of course, things were going to get a little bit difficult when Elizabeth grew up and Mary was the queen, but we'll come to that in a minute. Dangerous times were ahead. After this appalling childhood, in a lot of ways an appalling childhood, she had the protection of Catherine, but when Catherine died, Elizabeth was in a vulnerable position. She didn't have anybody especially looking out for her, and there continued to be this abuse from Catherine's husband. Now, of course, since Catherine is dead, Seymour is actually planning or hoping to marry her. And he himself gets into trouble into political trouble by plotting to replace his own brother as the royal protector of the boy king Edward. Seymour, Thomas Seymour, the one who was abusing Elizabeth, was put to death for treason. His treason was against his own brother. He tried to replace his brother as the kind of protector of the boy king, Edward. Elizabeth, as was to happen later on, found herself uncomfortably close to the political situation. There was some suspicion that she was involved because of her closeness to Seymour, even though she apparently didn't really want that closeness. There was some suspicion kind of fell on her that maybe she was politically involved in this plot that Thomas Seymour made against his brother. But she was clever enough, you know, to say, you can't prove anything against me. She was clever enough not to be in a position where they could do anything to her. And she continued to show that cleverness throughout the next period of time, which was particularly dangerous. Once Mary became queen, again, there were plots against Mary as the Catholic queen. The Protestant reformers were obviously against her. As you could see, a number of them, a large number, were burned, and there was a rebellion. Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion against Mary. He wanted to get rid of her as queen, and again, it was suspected that Elizabeth was involved, or that she knew about it, or she was in some way part of that plot. And once again, there was no proof. But Mary, to keep things safe, locked her sister, her half-sister, locked Elizabeth up in the Tower of London and kept her kind of basically a prisoner. It's not like she was in a dark dungeon with water dripping off the walls and rats running around. She would have been in luxury, but she wouldn't have been free to go. That would be the way that a royal person would be treated normally in those days. So she was kept in prison, and she, you know, really had to play a very careful game. Like, for example, pretending to be Catholic, because Mary was. If she said, "Oh no, I support Protestants," Mary would say, "Well, you're too dangerous. I'm going to have to chop your head off. I don't want to, because, you know, we did have a nice time playing together as kids, but you know, that's the safest thing for me right now." But Elizabeth said, "No, I support Catholicism, and I'm not challenging you, and you're my sister, and I would never do anything against you." And she managed to convince Mary at that time. So yeah, the way she survived was just by being very careful and, you know, conforming outwardly and accepting, you know, the demands that were put on her, including that demand of pretending that she was, well, was basically pretending that she was a Catholic. And so she outlived her brother, who died when he was 15 years old, and she outlived her sister, who was only queen for 5 or 6 years. You can see in a book that she had at the time, it's a Latin basically prayer book, and she writes in it a little verse here, "Your loving mistress Elizabeth." It says, "No crooked leg, no bleared eye, no part deformed out of kind, nor yet so ugly half can be, as is the inward suspicious mind." Quite possibly a message to Mary. There's nothing so ugly as your suspicious mind. No physical deformity could be as ugly as your suspicion against me. I'm your sister. Okay? And it is signed, you know, "Your loving Elizabeth." She probably kept it secret from Mary. I wouldn't expect her to show it to Mary, but these words were written in her prayer book at the time that she was imprisoned by Mary, and it's quite likely that those words are her kind of personal message of what she really thought about Mary. It's very ugly that you keep me locked up here. It's very ugly that you suspect me in that kind of way. So anyway, yeah, Mary in due course dies, and Elizabeth accedes to the throne. She becomes the queen. Because she didn't have a child, her sister didn't have a child, Mary, there were two people who had a sort of claim, both women. Mary Stuart, better known as Mary Queen of Scots. You remember Henry VIII's sister had married the King of Scotland. Okay, so there's that side of the family, and on that side of the family you have Mary, Queen of Scots. She was the granddaughter of that sister of Henry VIII, Margaret. She'd married King James IV of Scotland. So she was one of the contenders, one of the claimants to become queen after Mary's death. Do be careful here, you've got these two Marys. You've got Mary Tudor, who actually was Queen of England, and you've got Mary Queen of Scots, who never was Queen of England. All right, and she would be Mary Stuart. Okay, so please notice the important difference. Sometimes students get confused about the two Marys. Mary Tudor, who was Queen of England, the Bloody Mary, she's known as, and Mary Queen of Scots, who was she had a claim to be the Queen of England, but she never, in fact, became the Queen. And yeah, Elizabeth was the other claimant, and obviously Elizabeth was the one who got it. She took the position of Queen after her sister Mary's death. So Mary, Queen of Scots, was the Catholic champion, and Elizabeth was the Protestant champion. Mary was only 17, and she was in France, so she wasn't really, in the middle of all the action. She was a bit too far away to be able to influence things all that much. She spent most of her life in France, in fact, because Scotland was moving in a more and more Protestant direction, and which meant that Scotland was actually getting closer to England. If you remember way back in that first lesson, I said that Scotland, during the kind of before the Tudor period, Scotland had been getting very friendly with France. So that England had an enemy to the north and an enemy to the south. And England was getting friendly with Spain to sort of squeeze France, and Scotland was getting friendly with France to sort of squeeze England. But as the Reformation continues in the 16th century, Scotland starts coming close to England again because they've both got this Protestant religion, and it's bringing them closer together. France was basically a Catholic country. Mary, of course, was Catholic, and at the time of Mary Tudor's death, France was going through an uprising by the Protestants, and so Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't get enough support, and Elizabeth was the one who became queen. Now I'm going to just take a little look here at this Mary Queen of Scots. She's got an important relationship here with Elizabeth, and their fates between them changed the course of history. So I think we need to say something about Mary as the Catholic rival for the throne. And what happened in the end was Elizabeth became queen, and in the end Mary lost her head. She was beheaded. So I'd just like to go through Mary's story a little bit, because again, as I say, these people had extraordinary lives. Oh, I forgot to tell you. Look at the end of your print. I think there are 6 of them, okay? Keep you awake, all right? Something to watch out for. Okay, I think she's the second one now, because I think Elizabeth was did Elizabeth wink before? Yeah, I forgot to mention it. I was too busy talking, I forgot to point it out. So she's actually the second one, and the first one was Elizabeth, okay? a bit slow there. I put these things in and forget to tell you about them. So anyway, yeah, that's something to keep you awake. Keep watching and see if you can get all 6 of them. Yeah, so she loses her head, she loses her life in the end. But she has an extraordinary life, and I'd like to look at it a little bit. The Elizabethan settlement is the religious agreement that Elizabeth made for England to be a Protestant country, but not a very, very strong Protestant country. Remember, we looked at that pendulum swinging across the 16th century, backwards and forwards, and this was the point at which it finally sort of stabilized with the Elizabethan settlement. The church today still follows that basic settlement as a sort of not very Protestant church. Well, it seemed that she was, Elizabeth that is, that she was very strongly welcomed as queen and received by the people very positively at her coronation ceremony in 1559. So she got off to a good start. And then first thing she needed to do was to make firstly the act of supremacy, which meant that anybody who held a public position must accept that she is not just the Queen, but she's the head of the Church of England. And then the act of uniformity, which says what kinds of prayers are going to be used in our church, which establishes the church as a Protestant church. These 2 acts together are called the Elizabethan settlement, saying that the Queen, or the monarch, if it's a man, but the Queen in this case, is the head of the church, and also saying that the kind of church that we've got, what kinds of prayers we say, what kind of church it is. So that's the Elizabethan settlement. Okay? Okay, people are still writing things down, so give you a little moment there. All right, so she establishes her status as queen and as the head of the church, and she establishes the church as a Protestant church and what kind of teachings it has. She is, you know, a woman among men. This is sort of interesting, you know, surrounded here by all her courtiers and advisors, and they're all men, and she's the one woman in the center of it all. You look through the whole thing, it's all men. All right? There's not a single other woman there apart from herself. So she kind of a woman in a man's world, really, looking at it from that point of view. And let's get into some details of her church. What kind of agreement did she make? What was this Elizabethan settlement? Well, one thing was that she got rid of that crime of heresy, which Mary was using. That came to be seen. That's the terrible thing that the Catholics do. They punish people just for what they believe. People can't help or choose what they believe. That's what they believe. That's part of who they are. You can't punish people for that. Elizabeth says you can't punish them for heresy. You shouldn't be punishing people for heresy. So she would say, no, their crime was that they were not loyal to the throne. It doesn't matter whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant, you have to accept that I am your queen, she's saying. Okay, so She's not punishing people because they believe a different religion. In theory, at least, that's not what's happening now. The crime is now treason. And of course, Catholics were more likely to commit treason because they were more likely to be against the Queen, but they weren't, strictly speaking, they weren't being published for believing a different religion. They could believe in their heart whatever they wanted to believe as long as they showed loyalty to the Queen. But, you know, it wasn't quite as easy as that because loyalty included things like you have to go to the church. You have to go to the Protestant church, which was difficult for some Catholics. So it wasn't a straightforward thing. Anyway, as we know, all through that reign and all during the 17th century, apart from, of course, the time of the Puritan Revolution, which and the time of the Puritan rule, England was basically kind of keeping a middle road between being a Catholic, sort of following Catholic doctrine quite often fairly closely, and at the same time trying to allow the more Protestant, the strong Protestants were the Puritans, trying to allow some of their beliefs so that it was kind of wide net, a kind of catch-all. She would get as many Catholics in there as she could, she'd get as many Puritans in there as she could, and say, just compromise a little bit, just compromise a little bit, and we'll carry on with a kind of broad church that will satisfy as many people as possible. That was her aim, anyway. So, at the same time, in terms of church history, we get the winking Richard Hooker. And he wrote a huge amount of stuff that basically was like all the little details of what this Church of England is and what it's about. And it's called the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. It's still kind of the central document for the Church of England. It was an 8-volume work, and it came out over a long period. The first volume, 4 volumes, are the most important, and they came out in 1593. So that's a sort of defining statement, the definitive statement of what the Church of England's theology is, and as I say, it still carries some weight today. So you've got the Church developing its kind of middle way Protestantism. Okay, now marriage. Everybody supposed that Elizabeth would get married. After all, Mary did. Okay, Mary married the King of Spain. What about Elizabeth? Who's she going to marry? Well, I already let the cat out of the bag earlier on when I told you about her traumatic childhood and the fact that she never did marry. So that wasn't clear to people at the time. They just were thinking, well, who will she marry? An international marriage would have, consolidated power. So, however, although she, kind of flirted with the kings and princes of Europe quite considerably, the person who was closest to her affections was not a foreign prince or king or anything. He was an English nobleman called Robert Dudley. She was not in a position to marry him. It's not clear whether she would have married him, if there hadn't been this big scandal, but there was a big scandal about the death of his wife. Dudley was married and his wife fell downstairs. Or did she? Was she pushed? Did he push her? Okay, in order to be free to marry Elizabeth. So Elizabeth's advisors were just sort of like, do not go anywhere near Dudley. The scandal is too strong. People will be very angry. You know, there's a strong suspicion that he killed his wife in order to be able to marry Elizabeth. So the advice was, don't go anywhere near him. And yes, as I say, there are a lot of foreign royals, princes and kings. You've got Philip of Spain, Eric of Sweden, Charles of Austria, and the two dukes of Anjou in France, Henry and Francis. She flirted with all of them. And I'm not sure, you know, because people's views of history change, but what I was taught at school was, you know, it was kind of wazato. She knew what she was doing. She was playing a game saying, look, you know, you don't have to fight with England. You don't have to be our enemy. I might marry you. Isn't that a lot easier than fighting us to get control of us? If you marry me, you get control of the country. Okay? And she kind of was consciously playing a game. Or at least that's what historians were saying when I was kind of a schoolboy. I'm not sure that they all think that these days, just that that's how it worked out. And some of it may have been conscious. She may have been, you know, trying to play some sort of political game through that, but it's not exactly clear. So yeah, she had all these possible relationships, all these possibilities, but in the end she didn't marry. Dudley was locked up in the Tower of London at the same time as the young Elizabeth, so they'd been friends, you know, all their lives, really. They were imprisoned together during those dangerous times, and so that's how she had formed this friendship. May have been a loving, probably was a sexual relationship. I mean, although Elizabeth was famous as the Virgin Queen, I don't think she was a virgin at all. She probably had not just one, but several lovers. I think that's what most historians think, okay? That she probably did have a number of lovers. But Robert Dudley was always rather special to her. King of Spain, well, of course, he had been the husband of the previous Queen of England. He had been Mary's husband. And, you know, he played an important role in Elizabeth's England, at the time of Elizabeth's England, although she rejected him as a possible husband. And who else? Well, basically there were quite a few others, but in the end she never married. And as I said, she became known as the Virgin Queen, although it's very doubtful that she really was a virgin. Mary and Mary Queen of Scots and her extraordinary life, which is of particular importance because Mary was really one of the biggest problems that Elizabeth had to face. England was very divided between Catholicism and Protestantism. Elizabeth, as the Protestant queen, you know, had the support of some of the people, but there were still many people who supported the Catholics and therefore supported Mary. Now, yeah, talk about an exciting life. She's only 1 week old and she's already been made queen. That's why she's called Queen of Scots. She was the Queen of Scotland. And then at the age of 6 months, she's engaged to be married. What a life, okay? By the time she's 6 years old, six months old, she's been queen, and she's engaged to be married to Edward But you remember, of course, Edward was king for a short period of time, but he died at the age of 15. So Catholic forces in Scotland broke that match and said, no, we don't want our future queen, or our queen, our baby queen, to be marrying the English king. We want our old relationship with France. Okay, this is going right back to the Middle Ages, Robert the Bruce, William Wallace, the time that's described, well, Macbeth, before Macbeth in Shakespeare's drama. Macbeth, again, was a historical Scottish king. Scotland had been pushed around by England in the Middle Ages and had broken away from that and instead made its friendly relationship with France. And they said, no, we don't. The Scottish people were still kind of, at that stage, still supporting their relationship with France. We don't want our queen to marry the English prince. We want a stronger relationship with France. And so she was sent to France and spent most of her childhood in France. And then at the age of 15, she got married to Prince Francis of France, who then became the King Francis. And then just a year after that, well, he died. Okay, so you marry, you're a queen, you're the Queen of France for a year or so, and then your husband dies. And what are you supposed to do? Okay, so this is all, she's still a teenager. Okay. And then after her husband's death, after Francis's death, Mary decides to go back to Scotland. It's a bit confusing. That's all starting from here. Okay. She decides to go back to Scotland because, of course, she's still the Queen of Scotland. She's no longer the Queen of France because her husband has died, but she's still the Queen of Scotland. Although she's never lived there, she doesn't really know Scotland very well. And I don't know how much she realised, but Scotland was at this time moving away from its Catholicism. Scotland was moving more and more into being a Protestant country. And Protestant reform was getting stronger and stronger. So it was quite dangerous, actually, for Mary to go to her country at that stage. Here's the main reformer, John Knox, the Scottish reformer. He's the person who's bringing Scotland more and more into a Protestant direction. And you'd have to do a separate study to work out, why he had so much influence in Scotland at that time and why the Scottish people were persuaded by the Protestant reform. But the general pattern was that the northern countries of Europe felt more comfortable with Protestantism, and the southern countries felt more comfortable with Catholicism. Today, of course, Germany, England, and Scotland, northern European countries are basically Protestant, and the southern countries mostly are, Italy, Spain, okay, France. Catholicism is the main religion. So. Hello? That's not a winking person, is it? We now get an extraordinary situation where Mary marries her cousin, Henry Stuart, or Lord Darnley. And Lord Darnley, for some reason, gets jealous of Mary's private secretary, an Italian by the name of David Rizzio, and he murders his wife's secretary. The secretary in those days, it perhaps doesn't quite sound so important as it was. Okay, it would be an important position. He'd be like a scribe. He'd be writing her official documents. He'd be an important person who was close to his wife. For some reason, he seems to have been jealous of something. And anyway. He murders the Italian secretary of his wife, and then he gets murdered himself. Okay? And what does Mary do? She marries the person who probably murdered her husband. You couldn't make this stuff up, could you? I mean, if you were writing a novel, well, would your imagination come up with something as bizarre as this? Okay, this is real life. Okay, truth is stranger than fiction. She marries the man that's accused of murdering her husband, and the marriage was incredibly unpopular in Scotland. So she was in danger. She had to abdicate. She had to remove herself from the position of Queen of Scotland. In fact, she had to escape from Scotland at that time, and she fled to England. And she left the throne of Scotland to her son, who was just 1 year old, James the Sixth, who was the child that she had with Darnley. And so he's going to be important to us later on, okay? Because we're going to move on later into the Stuarts. Notice the Miogi, notice the family name Stuart, Mary Stuart, and James Stuart. This is the Stuart family of Scotland, and of course this course that we're studying here is the Tudors, who were originally a Welsh family, and then the Stuarts, who are a Scottish family. And throughout the 17th century, it's going to be the Stuarts who are kings or queens of England. So, as I say, it's a fantastic story, isn't it? Intrigue and murder and betrayal, and you probably couldn't make it up if you tried. And it gets well, even better or even worse, depending on how you're looking at it, because she escapes to England from an angry Scotland that's really shocked by her behaviour and by what's going on, and she goes to ask Elizabeth to help her. She's asking her to help her get her throne back as the Queen of Scotland, but Elizabeth's more worried about the fact that Mary is a risk to her own position, to Elizabeth's position as the Queen of England, because of course all the Catholics in England say, oh, the Catholic Queen of Scotland has come to England and we would like her to be our Queen. She missed her chance back there because she was in France and she wasn't, able to get enough support, and Elizabeth became Queen, but she's the one that we've always wanted to be our Queen because she's Catholic. So Elizabeth knows this, and Elizabeth is worried about it. So pretty much for every year of Elizabeth's life, especially through the first 20 years or so, there was a plot to kill her. Somebody was always trying to kill Elizabeth. She was always having to put down some kind of plot or mini-rebellion or something like that, very often by Catholics who wanted to replace Elizabeth and install Mary as the Queen. So it was really too dangerous for Elizabeth to let Mary go free. And you've got to remember who Elizabeth's father was, after all, Henry VIII. I mean, Henry VIII would probably have chopped Mary's head off straight away. But Elizabeth, at least she wasn't quite like her father. It seems that she didn't enjoy these situations where she had to, be strict or, there was a lot of, as I say, there were a lot of attacks on her and a lot of plots against her, and they were put down quite brutally. But it doesn't seem as if she regarded it as anything other than an unfortunate necessity. And the same with her sister, her half-sister, it's her cousin. The same with her cousin Mary. She doesn't really want to lock her up and keep her as a prisoner, but she doesn't have much choice. Okay, if she lets Mary go free, it's too dangerous. Once Mary's free, she can go around the country getting support and build up an army, and the next thing that Elizabeth knows is that she's going to get attacked by a large army of people who want to have Mary as queen, and and want to get Elizabeth out. So yeah, she would be living in luxurious circumstances, but she was a prisoner. And this went on for quite a number of years, but finally, in 1587, there was a Catholic plot to kill Elizabeth, and Mary was found to have been writing letters and to have been in communication with the plotters. And that was one step too far. Okay? Up until then, Mary had always been able to say, look, it's not my fault if they're doing this. I'm not asking them to do it. I'm your prisoner. What can I do? I can't stop them. And it's not my fault if they want me to be queen. But I'm not encouraging them. Well, on this occasion, it was proved that she was encouraging them. She was writing letters, she was involved, and that was one step too far. And Elizabeth reluctantly felt that it was inevitable, and she had to put Mary to death. So Mary was beheaded in 1587. And this now impinges on international politics. Here she is. Here's her head on a platter. She was considered one of the most beautiful women of her day. And so it was rather shocking that the executioner, often these people whose job it was to chop people's heads off seemed to do it very badly. Quite possibly they would get drunk first or something. So he missed her neck on the first stroke, killed her on the second stroke, and then when he held up her head, her hair fell away and was seen to be a wig. And she, katsura, wig, wasn't her real hair. And for a woman who'd been famous as one of the most beautiful women in Europe, in death, she looked pretty awful. And as I say, this now impinged on the international situation. Spain had been having problems with England for a very long time. He had been very patient, the King of Spain, King Philip. Elizabeth wouldn't marry him, so he couldn't be King of England again, as he was when he married Elizabeth's half-sister Mary Tudor, but he was very patient with Elizabeth for a very long time. He was patient when she refused to marry him. He was patient when English ships attacked and plundered Spanish ships returning from the Americas. At this stage, Spain was the main colonizer of the New World, of America. And they would bring back ships laden with treasures, the Inca gold, and the treasures of the New World. And before the ships could get back home to Spain, the English would attack them. And Philip was constantly complaining to Elizabeth, saying, you really shouldn't let your ships do that. You really shouldn't let your men do that. And she's saying, I'm so sorry. Yes, I know. Yes, yes. I tried to stop them. He was very patient with her, but basically, England was his enemy. Okay? And he was even patient when she made an alliance with the Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, which were at that time under Spanish control. So he really did bend over backwards to keep his temper with Elizabeth and to not to engage in war with her. But it seems as if this was one thing too much. Chopping off the head of a Catholic, what was she? She wasn't queen anymore, but she'd been the Queen of Scotland. She was a Catholic royal. And chopping her head off seems to have been the last straw for Philip. He said, finally, mo takusang, I'm not accepting this. And he went to war with England, very famously. So he finally accepted that there was no chance of getting a Catholic back on the English throne, and he decided, as I say, to go to war. He felt that was the only possible option at this stage. Okay. see, I hear pens scratching, so I'll leave it for a little bit longer. Yeah, is it okay? Can I carry on? Okay, so yeah, we now come to, in terms of international politics, a watershed which is of huge importance for the history of England. We come to the Spanish Armada of 1588. It was called the Invincible Armada. Invincible means unbeatable. We cannot lose. We are the Spanish Armada. We cannot lose. We are the most powerful navy in the world, which in theory they were. And Spain was the greatest power in Europe, while England was still just a fairly small country of no particular importance, stuck up there in the corner of Europe, or off the shore even. So it seemed like a foregone conclusion that Spain would win this. But against all expectations and against all the odds, England actually won. And this was really, as I say, a kind of watershed, because the balance of power in Europe now shifted. Spain slowly but surely started to decline, and its power started to weaken. And from this time onwards, England's power steadily gets stronger and stronger. To be honest, some of it was probably just an accident of the weather. A storm blew up, and the Spanish ships were blown out of control, and were not, the weather came to the help of the English. Another thing would be the actual ships that the English were using. They were using much smaller ships than the Spaniards. The Spanish ships were much bigger, great for going across the ocean, great for going to America, big ships, but not very good at moving quickly. And in a battle situation, you need ships that can just sort of dart in there, bang, 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 get out again, okay? Move around to the other side, and bang, 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 and kind of attack from different positions and move around flexibly. And the English ships were much smaller and were much more flexible in that way. So they also had an advantage because of that. And then we come to the final years of Queen Elizabeth's reign. Actually, the Spanish Armada was in 1588, but things have been getting worse with Spain for a while. And even after the Spanish Armada, Spain and England continued to be at war with each other until the year following Elizabeth's death. So Spain continued to be a kind of dark shadow over the last years of Queen Elizabeth. And then, just after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth sent support to the new Protestant king of France. Okay, yeah, I think perhaps in answer to that question about why France wasn't supporting Mary, the challenge was very real. Okay, that rebellion back at the time of Elizabeth's accession failed, but later on Protestants did seize control in France. So France was kind of in a kind of swinging pendulum between Protestant and Catholic. Not quite in the same way as England was, but in certainly this struggle between Catholics and Protestants was going on politically all across Europe, and France was very much involved. So what Elizabeth's quality was here was she would promise support to Protestants in Europe, just like the Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. But on these occasions, it seemed that she didn't really follow through. She'd make the promise, she'd send the soldiers, and then she wouldn't somehow seem to understand that the soldiers need food, the soldiers need weapons, the soldiers need, you've got to keep on supporting them. Just sending them there and forgetting about them, that's not going to do it. They're going to die, they're going to get attacked and killed. You need to support them, and she wasn't very good at that. apparently. Yeah, her support was not particularly helpful. And then you've got Ireland, and of course Spain is allied with Ireland because they're both Catholic countries, and they're both opposed to England. In fact, after the Spanish Armada, a lot of those ships were blown up onto the coast of Ireland. So you go to Ireland and you'll find people with a Spanish Miorgi, a Spanish family name, even today. For example, one of the Irish prime ministers in the 20th century was de Valera, Eamon de Valera. De Valera in Spanish, it's a Spanish name. Okay, so you've got quite a lot of, and I knew personally, I knew an Irish woman who just looked like totally Spanish. She looked totally Spanish. She didn't look Irish at all. So that's still a feature of Ireland, and its relationship to Spain has historically been quite important. There was some pretty bad things going on in Ireland. In 1582, about 30,000 people starved after an uprising against English rule. And for the last 10 years or so of Elizabeth's reign, England and Ireland were basically fighting openly, with Spain supporting Ireland. And so England was under pressure during those last years of Elizabeth's life. She was less popular at home than she had been, and the golden age was kind of coming to an end. She strengthened her severity against the Catholics, and there were also crop failures, there was social unrest. It wasn't really a very happy ending to all of this. And of course, in those days, people would superstitiously see a connection between the crop failures and the Queen herself. They'd say, oh, it's because of her religious policies, God's punishing the country, this kind of thing. So, that would add to the problems. And in terms of her personal life, she had, again, probably her lover, certainly her favourite, her pet, Robert Devereux, led a rebellion against her, and again she was in the unpleasant position of chopping off the head of somebody who was a favourite of hers, and quite probably, most historians would say they were lovers. She seems to have gone into something of a depression after this. The following year she died. She went into a depression the following year. She died in 1603. And it had already been agreed that the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, James VI, remember we mentioned him as a little baby just a little while back, that he would be the king after Elizabeth died. So no children, and the closest family is the Scottish family, the Scottish king. And so it ends. As I say, it was a bit like, what we've got now, where I can't remember a time when Elizabeth II had not been the Queen of England, and in those days, most people couldn't remember a time when the first Elizabeth had not been the Queen. And so her death was an occasion for national mourning. And yeah, it was the end of an era, the end of an age. And people sort of look back to it with sentimentality later on. So that's it, really. That's basically the story of Elizabeth and her reign.